Good evening, folks. I know that voice. Where are you, Bill? Hey, Bill, how are you? All right, let's everybody have a seat. We're ready to begin today's program in a Jefferson fashion. We try not to keep you waiting too long. For those of you who don't know me, I am Ferky Ferrati, and I am the president of the Jefferson Educational Society. And thank you for coming to tonight's program with a hope that we can bring some clarity on what is happening in Washington. Is there something happening in Washington? Some housekeeping for everybody here. Please silence your phones. Ben, are we doing index cards or? Yeah. So there should have been index cards that have been passed at the door. If you don't have one, raise your hand and somebody will bring you an index card and a pencil for you to write your questions. Now, to be nice to our moderator, try to write clearly. Thank you. I tell folks, like, what do you do for a living? I tell them that I am a professional beggar. And what I do is I raise money to keep this organization going and growing and becoming the best think tank for any community to have it as its own. One of my dear friends, our vice chair, Bruce Ramey, who is not here tonight, but he sends everybody his regards, has been thinking about how do we keep the Jefferson here for future generations. And what he's done for us is, in a partnership with the Erie Community Foundation, he is matching gifts up to $25,000, dollar per dollar. And that money will be put in an endowment at the Community Foundation, which means we can't get access to it with the exception of its interest, so that future generations of Erieites will have a Jefferson Educational Society. So if you're thinking of making gifts, to the Jefferson, right now is the perfect time to do so, and you can double your impact. And the other thing I tell folks is that you cannot build a strong institution without a strong team. And we have a heck of a team here at the Jefferson. I think it's the best team in town. We've got Ben and Andy and Pat and Jake and Christine and Chelsea and Dia and Time and Chloe, Matt, Bailey, Leanne, and so many volunteers. Those are the folks that keep this organization moving. We have recently added another team member, and I'll say a little bit more about that, but we're very excited to announce it. But before we do that, I do want to just quickly introduce our speakers tonight, because if I go through their resumes, I'd be here all night, and nobody wants to see that. Here, returning to the Jefferson stage for the third time, is Jay Cost, who is the Gerald R. Ford Nonresident Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And making her debut at the Jefferson Society is Amy Parnes, who is the Senior Political Correspondent at The Hill, and Molly Reynolds, who is a Senior Fellow of Governance at the Brookings Institution. And moderating tonight's program is Steve Scully, Director of the Brock Institute and Senior Advisor of Strategic Development, and I can't believe I'm saying here, but it is what it is, here at the Jefferson Educational Society. Welcome to the team, Mr. Steve Scully. That's how you're supposed to do it, is find the talent and let them do what they do best. And we are so thrilled that Steve has taken the duties of Charlie Brock, who this program is hosted by the Brock Institute, and the legacy he's left. I saw Mary Lincoln here, his wife. Where is Mary? Mary, thank you for all your support, and we are trying to do we are working really hard to make you proud and to make our great, great godfather proud up in the heavens. So with that said, I will turn it over to Steve. Thanks, everybody.
So I promised Molly and Jay and Amy springtime in Erie. It is gorgeous. The flowers will be blooming. It's early April, and Amy said, I cannot wait to come to see springtime in Erie. Welcome.
And I'm a Floridian. I'm from Miami, so.
Let me begin, first of all, for your Easter basket. This is Molly's book, Exceptions to the Rule. It's available after the program if you're interested. This is out just about a week.
Yeah.
It's called Fight, the Inside Story of the 2024 Campaign. We'll get to that in just a moment. Can we tee up that you're heading to California?
Yeah.
Gavin Newsom?
We're doing Gavin Newsom's podcast in a couple weeks.
And Jay Cost, back for the third time. Welcome from Zelienople, Democracy or a Republic. So, Jay, I want to begin on that front because we remember from our history book from Joyce Savacchio and Ted Vicky at Strong Vincent High School, the famous words by Benjamin Franklin, do we have a democracy?
Yeah, we have a democracy. Well, Franklin said, Franklin was asked after the convention ended, well, doctor, what have you given us? And he said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. Do we have a republic? I don't know. I mean, because I guess the serious answer to that question is that Republican government is not simply about the inputs. It's not simply about the everybody gets to vote, which we have. It's also about the outputs. Is public policy being designed for the general welfare rather than one faction or another? Are individual rights being respected? That, I think, is debatable. When I wrote a book in 2015, I wrote a book called Republic No More, in which I feel like we have a mixture in this country of democracy and oligarchy, and I still think we have that.
So, Molly, Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress, our founding fathers had the wisdom to create Congress first.
Yeah, they put it first in the Constitution for a reason.
So are we seeing Congress rise to the occasion in 2025?
No, I mean, I don't. This is not going to sort of beat around the bush here. I think you're absolutely right that they put them first in the Constitution for a reason, and I think what we're seeing is a moment where our partisan politics have kind of overtaken the ability of the Congress to fulfill its institutional responsibilities. I will say that while it is particularly acute right now, this is not a new phenomenon. Really, what we're seeing this year is the culmination of several decades of Congress being willing increasingly to sacrifice their own power to the executive branch, to sort of Jay's point about inputs versus outputs. A legislative branch that increasingly is willing to say, we don't care as much about how we get there, we just care about where we get to, and willing to kind of throw up their hands and say, if there's a president of my own party, I am willing to let that president do quite a lot to get what I want policy-wise out of the process, even if it means giving up my own power in a way that's very hard to get back if I ever want to try and do so. So I think that's really kind of where we find ourselves in this moment.
So, Jay, I saw this quote. I'm going to paraphrase it, but you had said, should the sovereign stand back? Maybe we could say, should the president stand back from politics and allow Parliament to work its will?
Well, you know, as Molly suggested, this is a long time coming. We are seeing a level of presidential governance that nobody has seen in our adult lifetimes. I mean, you could make an argument that Roosevelt during the New Deal was acting in this fashion. Maybe Wilson in his first term, but those are probably apples versus orange comparisons. And it is not. I mean, a lot of it is an institutional problem. A lot of it has to do with Congress as an institution, but I also think that one of the things that has increasingly happened is that even though Congress is a very weak institution and it doesn't reflect the public interest very well, it is still in its own way responsive to the public mood. And so members of Congress, because I think the expectation is now in the broader public presidential governance that Congress is, like, for instance, this is Mike Kelly is the congressman in this district. If Mike Kelly were to stand up and say to Donald Trump, no, I disagree with you. Donald Trump could, you know, tweet or Truth Social something like, get rid of Mike Kelly, he's no good. And even though Mike Kelly has been a hard-working member of Congress and has built up seniority, he would probably lose. And that's the sort of broader political dynamic that we're in right now.
Was that an editorial comment? By the way, not to be left unnoticed, the purple tie, so we thank you for that tonight. We are, Amy, in day 78 of the Trump presidency. By the way, how many of you voted in the 2024 election? I'm not going to ask you who you voted for. How many of you voted? And we are 576 days from the midterm elections. How many will be voting in November of 20? There you go. Wow. So, Amy, where are we today? We have the debate over tariffs, America's role in the world. We have DOGE. We have a restructuring of government. We had 4 years of a former president thinking about what the next 4 years would be looking like. And let's be honest, Donald Trump campaigned on all of this.
Yeah.
Should we be surprised?
No. I mean, I think we're a little bit surprised because he's taken it much further than the first term. It's a vastly different administration. He went into office thinking that he had a mandate, and he is really pushing the envelope. And when it comes to tariffs, for example, I'm hearing from Republicans that are secretly texting me, you know, Republican strategists, lawmakers, they're kind of uncomfortable with this moment right now. Even they're uncomfortable. So I'm curious to see how this plays out and whether President Trump has to kind of rein it back in because the optics are so not great for him right now. I know he keeps telling people, hold on, it's going to get better. But Republicans are even questioning that right now, quietly.
Like Ted Cruz, like Tom Tillis, like Mitch McConnell, like Susan Collins.
Yeah.
I mean, these are fairly loyal Trump Republicans, especially Ted Cruz, now trying to break with the president, at least on tariffs.
Yeah, and President Trump campaigned on the economy. It's why he's in office right now. I think he ran excuse me for those who didn't vote for him, but he ran a tighter, better campaign. He had a message about the economy, and now the economy, people are looking at their 401ks and they don't want to look at
Don't look.
Yeah,
don't look.
I can't look at mine, but they don't want to look. They are scared to look. These are people that supported him, and they're feeling very, very queasy about where they are right now.
So, Molly, I came across two quotes that I think tie in perfectly. Illuminate us on this. First of all, you said that the shock and awe confusion is all part of this point. Why?
So I think that when we sort of think about particularly the second Trump administration in comparison to the first, I think that part of what's going on right now is kind of a uniting of a couple of different factions within the Republican Party who all see sort of shock and awe as helpful to their underlying goals, but they might not all have the same underlying goals. So I think there are some folks who are sort of, particularly when we think about the expansion of executive power, which is something, as someone who thinks about Congress for a living, I spend a lot of time thinking about. There are some like real true believers in this administration who really believe in a very expansive view of the presidency. There are also some folks who are kind of getting involved in the administration because they want to extract retribution against people they don't like. Those are not necessarily the same people in Trump's orbit, but they both right now are kind of benefiting from a shock and awe campaign trying to have so much going on that it's hard to pay attention to what's happening, hope that whatever it is that happens that kind of pushes the boundary, something else comes along the next day, and it's difficult to keep track of all of it. But I kind of see that as a uniting strategy across a couple of different factions who haven't necessarily kind of hitched their wagons to President Trump for the same reasons.
So, Amy, Molly used the word retribution, and in your book, which, by the way, is available for sale afterwards, how did the retribution term come about in that Bret Baier interview in January of last year?
The Bret Baier interview.
The retribution will be my success.
Yes. Remind me. I can't remember.
So when we did the podcast, we were talking about how the president was saying, my retribution is going to be the country's success.
Yes.
And that how he tested that term to make sure that it came across as not the vindication that you talked about, Molly, that it was going to be the economy and the country, not personal retribution.
Yeah, and it's become exactly that. I mean, look at the DOJ, for example. It's become, all about his predecessor. And a lot of people are feeling increasingly uncomfortable with that. But then again, you have a lot of Republicans who are really happy about this, that they feel like, they don't agree with what Biden did. They think that everything is political and, that he should go after them.
So, Jay, there are a couple of photographs, if you're in the Oval Office, paintings. One is of Andrew Jackson. What do we need to know about Andrew Jackson that has really helped define Donald Trump in his second term?
There are a lot of parallels between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. And I feel like the parallels have really grown. I think that when Trump had the Jackson portrait in the Oval during his first term. And I think that when it was in the Oval during his first term, I think it reflected in a lot of respects Trump's view of himself as an outsider, looking to cleanse a government that he thought was corrupt. But when I see Jackson now in the Oval Office, I think I'm reminded of another parallel between Trump and Jackson, which is that Jackson's crusade against what he saw as corruption was a very personal crusade. Jackson personally felt that he was robbed of the presidency in 1824. In 1828, he blamed his political opponents for the death of his wife, Rachel, right before he took the oath of office. And so when you look at Jackson's tenure as president, Jackson had a tendency to, number one, personalize political disagreements, and number two, see himself as, it's always Jackson versus somebody. And I think that what we're seeing right now is that Donald Trump is the most anti-government president, at least since Ronald Reagan. But it's a different anti-government attitude. Whereas Reagan felt that government had gone too far, Trump, I think his anti-government ethos is not based on Reaganite conservatism, but rather a sense of the personal injustices that had been done to him that sort of also map onto his view of his electoral coalition.
The other portrait is that of our 40th president, Ronald Reagan, who hated tariffs, said it creates a trade war, says it creates an isolated America, and said that it only creates higher prices, a tax on consumers. Now, 40 years later, here we are.
Yeah, the Trump's, for lack of a better word, obsession with tariffs is, I think, politically damaging. I think that politically, Trump would do a lot better by framing what he's doing as putting China in a manageable place, which I think would probably make a lot of Reaganite conservatives comfortable. If Trump were to pitch, Selena Zito, who's a colleague of mine, had a column, I think 2 years ago at the Washington Examiner, where she reported on a story of a shirt maker, a manufacturer in Georgia, who did some chemical tests and figured out that the cotton that was in his shirts was from the Uyghur region of China. And if Trump were to recast this trade war as pushing back against the tentacles of the Chinese Communist Party, like for instance, a lot of people were like, well, why the tariffs on Vietnam? Well, one of the reasons is that Vietnam and Mexico are both sort of re-exporting Chinese goods. And the same with Mexico. I mean, if Trump could frame it as a Monroe Doctrine thing, and frame it as we made a policy mistake in the 90s with the Chinese, we need to correct it, but he's not doing that.
So, Amy, let's talk about the campaign and how we got to this point. We are in Pennsylvania. There are 67 counties in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and Donald Trump won 30 of those counties by 40 points or more.
Yeah.
So what was the message that Donald Trump had in rural Pennsylvania and rural America that resonated, and what were the mistakes of the Kamala Harris campaign?
So I think that, like in 2016, he had a message. And like I said earlier, he talked about the economy, he talked about immigration, and he really homed in on certain things that appealed to the electorate. And he knew, like him or hate him, he is a master brander, and he knew how to brand himself. He knew what message he wanted to portray. Even down to the attempted assassination with the fight, fight, fight.
Not far from here.
Not far from here. One of the most iconic images, I think, also, if you like him or hate him, you have to agree with that. Like it's going to go down in history as one of the most iconic. And he knew exactly what to do in that moment. Think of that. That is the most astonishing to me. But I think that he connected with voters in a way that the Democratic Party has failed to do in several cycles, even in 2020. My co-author and I wrote a book back then called Lucky about how Joe Biden barely won the presidency. If Donald Trump would have done something a little bit different, if he would have acted a little more presidential, he could have won. He has a way of connecting with voters that the Democratic Party has failed to do. And right now, we're seeing this play out, and we're seeing the Democratic Party try to scramble for a leader, a message, rewriting the script on what their grassroots operation looks like, how they reconnect with voters, because most of the people I would say a good number of the people who supported him in this election should traditionally be Democratic voters. Mm-hmm. So what has gone wrong?
So Molly, in a moment I want to come back and talk about what is happening in Congress today among the two parties. But Amy, I do have to ask you to go back to that debate on June 27th, which we all watched, and by all accounts it was a disaster.
Yeah.
As I watched Joe Biden walk on that stage in Atlanta at CNN, you knew right away things were not going to go well. Fast forward a couple of weeks later, MSNBC, Morning Joe, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi is in that interview. Take it from there. How did we get to that point? What did you learn in the book? And what did that tell you about the state of the Democratic Party?
So we learn in the book, and we open it, and I hope you guys read it. It's an interesting read, and I'm not just saying this because I co-wrote it, but you learn something on every page. You learn how we got here in this moment. And we open it with Nancy Pelosi in her living room because she's watching the debate play out, and she's fielding text messages from donors and lawmakers, and she's watching it alone because she clearly knows she's gone into this night thinking it's not going to go well. She had already tried to convince President Biden at the time not to do the debate. He does it anyway because he feels like, and his campaign feels like, they need to change the trajectory of the race. So they do it. It doesn't go well. And
that's an understatement.
Yes, understatement. And so Nancy Pelosi almost takes the reins because no one else is almost willing to do that. So she takes the reins and she's really in charge of what's next. So she goes on Morning Joe and she says, the president has a decision to make. Well, he's already made a decision. He's not only made a decision, but he sent, a letter to his colleagues, members of Congress saying, I'm still going to run. Don't count me out. He's doing rallies. She's essentially forcing his hand on Morning Joe because she's hearing from so many people. She's scared that not only are they going to lose the presidency, they're going to lose the Senate and the House. And she's, as former House Speaker, she's very concerned about her members. And so she goes on and she forces his hand. And as we reveal,
But Madam Speaker, he's made the decision.
he has made the decision and she keeps going. This hasn't been reported before until our book, but she talks to President Obama a couple of times. They're trying to figure out what to do. She goes to meet with Biden at the White House to have a meeting.
I'm sure that went well.
Yes, I mean, she told people after the fact that she had basically gotten her point across, that he had heard her. But she keeps going, and
So she's on Morning Joe. The reaction in Wilmington is what?
they are so angry. Lots of curse words. I can just say, F you, Nancy. They were really, really upset. And from there, it plays out. She takes probably the biggest role in forcing him out. She is constantly in touch with his advisors, and his back is up against a wall in the end. And we talk about this in the book, but he goes back to Wilmington. He has COVID. He's a lot sicker than most people knew. He was having respiratory issues, and he is forced to make the biggest decision of his political career.
And then he makes the decision. He calls the vice president. Then what happens?
So she had been downplaying the fact, she and her aides, they were all along saying, oh, we're behind Joe Biden, but they had been planning what to do in case there was a switch. The day of the switch, she has her advisors in her pool house at the Naval Observatory, and they're meeting and discussing what to do when, if and when, but really when.
That afternoon.
That morning. So when Joe Biden calls her, her advisors are already all meeting. And keep in mind, it's a Sunday. This isn't like Monday at 3 o'clock. It's a Sunday morning, and they're all gathered in her pool house talking about what to do. And they really just needed to coalesce the Democratic Party quickly. And that's what they were trying to do.
So then the rest of the story is the endorsement question. So just take it from there.
So President Biden calls Kamala Harris that Sunday and says, okay, I've made up my mind, I'm dropping out. And she says, are you sure? And he says, yes. And she says, well, are you going to endorse me? And he says, I'm going to, but maybe later in the week, maybe Wednesday or Thursday. And keep in mind, there are only 100-something days left until the election. And she says, Mr. President, I need your support right now. She knows that there are other Democrats who are trying to run against her. They had their eyes on Governor Pritzker. They thought other people, Gavin Newsom in California, was going to run. So she is really trying to gain support and do it quickly. And she knows that without his support, she's going to be in trouble.
And the news cycle from a Sunday through Wednesday. I mean, can you imagine
No.
what that would have been like?
Yes.
So, of course, the endorsement follows. So, Molly, with that background, that gives you a sense of the divisions and the turmoil back then within the Democratic Party. And they are still today trying to see their sea legs, including Hakeem Jeffries, including Chuck Schumer. And, of course, we saw Cory Booker last Monday, 25 hours and 5 minutes. So what are the challenges facing congressional Democrats, and what are the opportunities and challenges for congressional Republicans?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to remember that the biggest and most consequential divide in American politics is between the Democrats and the Republicans, but the divides within the parties are also real and they're also consequential. And at this moment, particularly because in the House of Representatives, the Republicans' margin of control is so narrow, any time that the Republicans in the House don't agree with each other on something, which is much of the time, it's that much harder to kind of get anything done. And so when I sort of think about what's happening in Congress right now, in some ways I think it's kind of a tale of two Congresses. So we have this Congress who, as I was saying in response to your first question, Steve, is really not pushing back against this really expansive use of executive power. We have things like the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, so the person whose job it is to have his finger on the direction of much of the federal budget, saying, you know what, it's okay if the executive branch is eliminating federal agencies, is doing things that are against what Congress has written into law, because if Congress can't get its job done, then sometimes the executive has to step in. So that's sort of one side of the story. At the same time, for the things that do actually require congressional action, and here I'm thinking about things like the tax legislation that is, in fits and starts, moving its way through Congress, there we really are seeing these divides within the Republican Party just make it really difficult for Congress to act. Again, even on things that they can do without needing to cooperate with Democrats, because they can do them on a party line basis. For the Democrats, meanwhile, I do think that they are, and Amy was talking about Speaker Emerita Pelosi, I do think that congressional Democrats are still trying to kind of figure out what they look like in a post-Pelosi era. I think that both in the House, where Leader Jeffries is still sort of trying to figure out what it means to lead that caucus, and then also in the Senate. And I think when we think about, Cory Booker's 25 hours speech notwithstanding, the degree to which I think a lot of Democratic voters are kind of frustrated with what they see or don't see Senate Democrats doing. I think part of the challenge is that folks' understanding of what it means to be a Democratic leader is so influenced by the long reign of Nancy Pelosi in the House. And so this idea of what it means to be an effective Democratic leader is, do you look like Nancy Pelosi? Do you do what Nancy Pelosi was good at doing? And there are big differences between trying to lead House Democrats and trying to lead Senate Democrats. And we can have a separate conversation about whether kind of Chuck Schumer is up for the job. But I do think that kind of, for many folks, the sense of what it looks like to lead a Democratic Party is just so tied up with what Nancy Pelosi was good at for so long, that's one of the sort of things that Democrats are trying to figure out, is what does it look like to have a leader who's not Pelosi?
And Amy, what was the line that you used about Nancy Pelosi sticking Joe Biden with a velvet knife?
Yeah. I mean, it got really, really bad and ugly. And
Have they talked?
They haven't. I mean, they came very close to talking at a White House holiday party where she posed for a picture with him. But in our book, we reveal that he's gathered on Air Force One with Jim Clyburn and Al Sharpton, and he thanks them for supporting him. And he says, the person I will never forgive is Nancy Pelosi. And his advisors say that he still feels that way to this day. He's so hurt. Jill Biden is so hurt by what she has done. They blame her. And I think they also blame his former partner, President Obama.
I'll come back to that in a moment. That's what we call a tease. But Jay, I want to get your thoughts, because I had John Oliver on my radio program today. Not that John Oliver. He did make me famous as the most patient man on television, but John Oliver from Visit Erie. And he pointed out that they've seen a 30% decline in Canadian tourism. I used to work at a mall at Halley's, if you remember Halley's many years ago, and I would see the busloads of Canadians coming to Erie because there's no tax on clothes. And I want to share with you this quote from the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, which is really heartbreaking. He said, "The old relationship with America is over," adding that Ottawa will impose additional tariffs that will have maximum impact, aka hurt, on the U.S. The largest border between two countries. We love the Canadians. It is heartbreaking when the national anthem is being played in Vancouver or Toronto and they're booing and jeering us. Your thoughts about this moment, and is there a historical precedent in all of this?
Well, I do think that Donald Trump represents a strain of political thought that is it is more than 30 years old. I think that it dates at least back to Pat Buchanan in 1992. And I think that it has remained a sort of a kind of third column in American politics. This idea that globalization has been bad for us, and this idea that the United States is getting, screwed by other countries. And I think that if you had tried to run something like this in 2004, it would not have worked. Because I think that at that moment, I think that even though there were people, obviously Donald Trump was still like this in 2004, there are certain trade protectionist diehards who have never given up that faith, right? Pat Buchanan would have been another one. But I think that it's taken on a life of its own, really. I think a lot of it has to do with the tepid economic growth of the last 15 years. And I think you could probably argue, actually, maybe the last 25 years even. The economy has continued to grow, but incomes haven't grown as much. And I think particularly since the 2008 recession. But you can even go back and look at Walter Mondale's attacks on Ronald Reagan in 1984, and when the economy was booming, and Mondale was making the point that the jobs that are coming back are not the jobs that we lost. Like the deindustrialization of the 70s, we recovered from it on paper, but there was a permanent kind of loss there. And I think, from my impression, so I live in Zillionople. I live just literally 5 minutes from the Butler County Fairgrounds where Trump was shot. And I think if you drive to places like, Elwood City, or you go to Butler, PA, the town, and you tell people the Canadians are mad at us, I think they'd say, good. I think the extent to which a large portion of the country feels that they have not meaningfully participated in the top line prosperity of the nation is staggering.
And that really is an important point. So, Molly, Stephanie Bice, Republican from Oklahoma, part of the House GOP leadership, I had a long talk with her last week, and we were talking about the first 100 days, and she said, look, Steve, he only has 100 days. If he doesn't do it in the first couple of months of his term, it will never get done. They learned the lessons of the last 4 years, and he is doing exactly what he told voters he would do. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we know from multiple presidential administrations that there's not something magic about exactly 100, but that that presidents tend to have this period in the beginning of their administrations where they are given sort of more running room. It's also the case that we sort of used to see presidents get kind of a honeymoon in public opinion in that first 100 days. That is much less true than it used to be, in large part because in general, voters have polarized on presidential approval. So it is, even prior to Donald Trump, so even during the Obama administration, Obama's approval rating among Republicans, I believe, broke 20%, something like once after the first 100 days, and it was the week the U.S. forces assassinated bin Laden. So it is very hard now to get large numbers of voters who identify with the other party to approve of a president. And so really, you're trying to do as much as you can while, to some degree, kind of your more independent-leaning voters in your own coalition are willing to kind of give you that running room. And I think particularly in this case, what we're seeing is President Trump try to do as much as he can, again, with a very expansive reading of executive power in this first 100 days, in part because it is proving very difficult for Congress to even, again, on things that Republicans can do by themselves to come to agreement on what that would look like. So if you read the reporting at the end of last year, Republicans had very grand plans for how fast they would move their legislative agenda in Congress. And it became clear very quickly that there was sufficient division within the House Republican Conference, within the Senate Republican Conference, and as we've seen over the past couple of weeks, between the two of them, in terms of kind of what they want to do and what's important. And that here, because of, President Trump has certain political gifts, helping legislators drive to agreement on complicated policy questions, that is not one of them. And so as we are kind of, again, moving through the things where Congress really does have to act, and where the questions are hard, and things about, the tax bill, tax policy is very complicated. That's not Trump's strength. And so I think, again, as we're kind of seeing, part of what we're seeing with them pushing as the boundaries as much as they can in these early days, some of it is also about trying to kind of make up for the fact that it's really difficult for Congress to act.
But I remember very well as a student at Strong Vincent High School, a very wise assistant principal, AKA history teacher, had told me, Steve, remember, this is Joyce Savacchio, by the way, Steve, remember that the other party may be the opposition, but in the House, the Senate is the enemy. I've never forgotten that.
It is, that is proving quite true.
Maybe this week especially.
Yeah, I believe it was this weekend when a prominent Republican in the House called the budget plan that the Senate approved last week something like deeply unserious. And so this really is just a situation where the Senate Republicans, by and large, have one view of what they want to do, which is informed in a lot of cases by really different electoral circumstances than House members. So obviously, senators run for re-election less often. Republican senators represent entire states. A number of Republican senators represent states where Medicaid, so sort of in addition to needing to figure out what to do about the expiring Trump tax cuts, another big kind of source of conflict within the Republican conference in Congress right now is how big might they want to make cuts to Medicaid. And there are a number of Republican senators who have to answer to their Republican governors about what they're going to do about something that makes up an enormous percentage of their state's budgets. And that just creates, again, different incentives in the Senate than it does in the House. The Senate has also decided that it cares more about making the Trump tax cuts permanent than it seems like House Republicans do. So there are lots of sources of disagreement. And here, because they're trying to move this legislation in a way that doesn't mean that they have to work with Democrats, Democrats can just sit back and say, hey, this is your problem. You're the ones who decided that you were going to take up these policy questions in a way that meant that you do not need our votes, and we are not interested in giving them to you if what you're going to do is cut taxes for wealthy individuals and make big cuts to social safety net programs.
Because, Jay, here in Pennsylvania, there are about 13 million residents, and over 3 million are on Medicaid. In Speaker Johnson's district, 40% of his constituents on Medicaid. So just from your standpoint, how does that affect the debate? Because to your point, they want to cut $900 billion out of Medicaid over the next couple of years.
Well, Republicans have been trying for a long time to reform entitlements, and they have never succeeded, really. I mean, there was compromise and an extension of Social Security in the early 80s.
1986.
Yeah, and of course, the Republicans' great idea or big idea on Medicare in the late 90s was to bring in insurance companies as sort of a private sector third party, and that didn't bend the cost curve. And look, it gets down to the essential, this is an essential issue within any government, which is the distribution of benefits and burdens. And because we have such wealth inequalities in this country, you can talk about increasing taxes and generate revenue from a relatively small slice of the country. It's not nearly as much as we need to balance the budget, but the point is that The wealthy who would pay higher taxes under a Democratic plan to raise taxes are not electorally significant. And moreover, they find ways around, they have other means of minimizing their tax burden. When you're talking about the distribution of social welfare, it is really astonishing how many different people within American society are recipients of social welfare. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, I went to when I lived in Jackson Township near Zillionople, I was talking to the township commissioner who was complaining about college kids getting student loans and, not doing anything with the, like this is a waste of money. And the guy ran an ambulance company. And it's like, who is his number one, what is the number one corporation that pays him? It's Medicare. That's, the government distributes revenues and benefits so broadly. This is one of the challenges of cutting any program in a democratic society. And so what happens, at least on the Republican side of the spectrum, is that you have this ideological opposition and an ideological demand to reduce the size, the scope, the intrusiveness of government. But then you also have the political reality, which is that these guys got to get reelected, right? Because they're in politics and they want to get reelected. And that is a problem. That is a problem that plagued Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had three goals. He wanted to increase military spending. He wanted to cut taxes. He wanted to reduce the size of the welfare state in a meaningful way. He got two of the three. He never managed to meaningfully cut social welfare spending.
Which is why we're at where we are today. Amy, I'm going to do the weave because we never lived through the Grover Cleveland presidency, the only other president who served 2 non-consecutive terms. Why am I bringing that up? Because the First Lady at the time said, "Don't worry, we'll be back." And of course, 4 years later, Grover Cleveland came back. So in the final days of the Trump presidency, what was happening in the White House?
Well, so it was right in the middle of COVID, right? And I think that sort of dictated, he was right. He found himself right in the middle of pretty much the biggest crisis that the country has faced. But he also was planning to come back. He didn't think that he lost, obviously, in 2020. He thought the election was stolen from him, which goes back to your whole point about retribution. And I think that from the moment he left office, he was planning on returning again. And, he had his first campaign rally just several weeks after and spent the entire next 4 years trying to plan his comeback, which is pretty remarkable.
He was in the political wilderness early on. He had only a few core aides that you write about, Susie Wiles, now the chief of staff, among them. Just give us a sense of what was happening early in 2021, 2022, before he formally entered the race.
Well, I think he spent some time trying to think about how to run a better, his other races were so chaotic. And so he brings in Susie Wiles, who runs a very disciplined, tight campaign, which is interesting because he has appointed her, she's now the White House chief of staff. And some people, you hear these headlines about Laura Loomer, for example, and people are questioning how he can take advice from someone like Laura Loomer. And I often wonder what Susie Wiles is thinking right now, because this is so vastly different from what she wanted her White House to look like and how she ran her campaign, how she ran his campaign. So I wonder what is going to happen over the next couple of months and whether she's going to prove victorious in sort of leading the White House.
So let's fast forward. We know the rest of the story. He's about to get the nomination. He has to select a running mate. Why J.D. Vance?
So interesting anecdote in the book. J.D. Vance obviously lobbies hard to get this. He really wants it. He's up against Marco Rubio. There is a fight that ensues on Trump Force One, on Trump's airplane, where Jason Miller, one of Trump's long-running campaign aides, is fighting with Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a big Marco Rubio supporter. And Jason Miller really wants J.D. Vance, and there's this fight happening Meanwhile, they're texting people who are not on the flight. J.D. Vance, long story short, comes in for an interview with Trump the morning of the attempted assassination. So he's flown in, private jet, to Mar-a-Lago. They meet. J.D. Vance is essentially making the point that he's a loyalist, that at one point he didn't really trust Trump, but he's got his back now, and really makes the case. Trump really likes him and he buys into the whole loyalist argument, which is interesting right now, because if you look at what we've just experienced with the Signal chat, they're at odds with one another, and their political ambitions are at odds with one another. Trump doesn't know what he's going to do in 4 years. J.D. Vance is obviously planning ahead. But he picks him because he thinks he is going to essentially be the best person, loyal person, and will kind of, take hold of the MAGA flag.
And of course, Donald Trump Jr. may run in 3.5 years.
Exactly, yes.
I'm just telling you what I'm hearing, okay? So let's stay with the running mates. Wow.
I know.
Jeez. Did I strike a chord? Last week, I had the chance to interview Governor Josh Shapiro, who, of course, was on the short list with Kamala Harris. I would probably argue it was between him and Tim Walz, as you point out in the book. He said, Scully, the only reason I'm doing the interview is because you're from Erie. And I said, great, come back to Erie and give us the future of Pennsylvania. We have a forum right here, so we'll see if he takes us up on it. But he was very gracious and very kind. Why not Governor Josh Shapiro? What were the factors that Kamala Harris and her campaign had to take into account?
Talk about political ambition, I think.
Is he ambitious?
He's definitely among the top contenders for 2028. No surprise here, right? But I think that when push came to shove, she didn't like the fact that she would have to constantly watch her back, I think. And he was very, he has his own ideas of what he wants to do. That worried her, and it worried those around her. I think she felt more comfortable with Tim Walz. I think also when you look at the time, Israel was a big concern, and we're sitting here in a synagogue. There was a concern that it would further fracture an already fractured Democratic Party.
Did he want to be vice president?
No. Does anyone want to be vice president?
Nice home, but no, you're right. But he felt that he had to go through the process.
He did. And, some people would say that he kind of preserved his right to run again. He would be kind of handicapped if he did serve as vice president. But yeah, I think it was a really big concern for her and her team. She wanted what she had with Joe Biden. And what's interesting is when she came in and they were considering whether or not to pick her for a running mate, his team had the same concerns about her, whether or not they had to constantly watch her and what she would be doing. And she proved to be quite a big loyalist to him. I mean, up until the very end, wouldn't even, we talk about this in the book, but he essentially told her, no daylight, kid. And she followed that, and she never really wandered off from him. She stuck close to him until the end, which was a really big concern. And I think that's quite significant.
So there's one other story I want you to tell, but I'm just curious by a show of hands. Had Governor Shapiro been on the ticket, not winning the election, but do you think that Kamala Harris would have won Pennsylvania if he was on the ticket? Interesting. And do you think a Harris-Shapiro ticket would have won the election? Yeah, I agree. The other interesting story, you talk about no daylight, The View, ABC's The View, Kamala Harris and her response. Just tell the story.
So for those of you who didn't follow it, and I imagine most of you have, but Kamala Harris goes on The View several weeks before the election and says, a host asks her, what would you do differently? And she says, not a whole lot, I'm paraphrasing. And backstage, her aides in campaign headquarters, they're like, what's she doing? We practiced this. And what she was supposed to say was, yeah, I'm really proud of what we did, but here's what I'm going to do. Here's my plan. And she didn't say that second part. It really, really encapsulated what the Trump campaign was trying to say about her, and they ran with that ad. It was, I think, one of the two most powerful ads of the final weeks of the campaign, because it basically summed up what they had been trying to say. They were trying to pigeonhole her and say that she's exactly a carbon copy and is running on the Biden agenda, and here she was saying it. And not a great moment for her, along with the trans ad, which we report in the book about how frustrated people like Bill Clinton were when they saw the trans ad and heard from people. Bill Clinton, he campaigns on gut feelings. He's out on the campaign trail and he's hearing from people on rope lines saying, why aren't they responding to this ad? He's frustrated. He picks up the phone and calls Jen O'Malley Dillon and the campaign brass, and they say, sorry, but that's not what our data is telling us.
Data analytics, BS.
Yeah.
So let's talk about loyalty in Congress with Donald Trump in this second term. And Molly, that's something that Donald Trump wants a lot of. I think that the person who has among the toughest jobs in Washington is John Thune as the Senate Republican leader, because he is an institutionalist. He wants to preserve the role of the Senate. He understands the duties of the Senate, and yet he is the Republican leader, and this is Donald Trump's Republican Party. So how does he thread that needle?
It's really hard. You're absolutely right. He does sort of style himself an institutionalist. He has said publicly, at least at this point, that there are a number of things about the institution of the Senate that he wants to protect. We will see if, when push comes to actual shove, if he does that. There are kind of a number of things about the way that the Senate may pursue its tax bill that are really going to test that commitment from John Thune, in terms of him saying, I don't want to open the door to getting rid of the filibuster. I want to sort of respect the institution of the Senate. But I think a big challenge for both Thune and also for Mike Johnson, although Mike Johnson has sort of come to that job in a very different way than John Thune came to his job, is that in the time since the first Trump administration, many, if not most, of the Republicans who were kind of willing at times to push back against President Trump, to stick up for the institutional interest of the Senate or the House, to sort of say, this is not my Republican Party, those people aren't in Congress anymore. And this has consequences both for kind of who, if anyone, is willing to push back against the Trump administration. And it also means that so many, you hear this sometimes about young voters, about how young voters only know sort of a Donald Trump world. That's also true of many, many members of the United States Congress. All they know, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle, is a party led by Donald Trump, and both sort of Trumpy politics and then what that also means for policy. And so if what you're trying to do, again, as Thune, I think, is right now, is lead a conference that is genuinely trying to write a piece of tax legislation, that's really hard when a lot of the forces that are around you are not sort of institutionally focused, and when also you have a president who, again, whose political gifts are several, but solving complicated policy problems for a conference that disagrees is not on that list.
Jay Costa, I'm going to weave in some of the audience questions. I am glad that we are finally not going to get screwed by the herd and the McDonald Islands, because I think they've been taking us to the cleaners. The penguins are going to be very happy. The memes have been terrific. But this is a question from one of the audience members. any of you can respond to this. How does the panel respond to the concerns that Trump is Putin's puppet, especially in light of the absence of tariffs on Russia and his response to Ukraine?
Well, my understanding with respect to Russia is we're not trading with them anyway at this point. I could be wrong about that. I'm not.
And we have sanctions.
Yeah, well, yeah, they're heavily sanctioned. So.
But what about Russia and Putin and the war?
I think that with respect to the war in Ukraine, there is a large faction in the Republican Party that doesn't want anything to do with it. And I think that if you go back and look historically at the Republican Party in the 19th century, really up until World War II, the Republican Party was an isolationist party. And what mobilized Republican opinion to be an internationalist party in the 1950s was the threat of international communism. And now that that threat has been removed from the West, I think a lot of Republicans are just really uninterested in worrying about the West. Likewise, I think a lot of Republicans are now more focused on China as the geopolitical foe. So I think if you understand not elite Republican opinion, not necessarily opinion within the Senate, but I think grassroots Republican opinion would be, this is not our problem. And I think Donald Trump, and look, I think Donald Trump is just instinctively like, this is not our problem. I mean, I think if you look at his rhetoric going back for decades, he's always sort of been a kind of an isolationist guy.
And we had this in the 1930s, the America First movement.
We did.
Molly?
Oh, well, I was just going to build on what Jay said, and to the extent that there are elite Republicans who are very supportive of sort of giving more assistance to the Ukrainians, when President Biden was in office, it meant one thing to sort of break with the voters on that issue because you knew that you were going to get what you wanted because Biden himself was quite supportive of this as well. But now, because Trump is not, there's no incentive to sort of break from the voter sentiment because you're not going to get what you're looking for in the end anyway.
Amy, this is for you. I'm concerned about the First Amendment to the Constitution when the president goes after the AP simply because they will not refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America.
Yeah, I mean, it's really troubling. This is a president who calls the media fake news. And just to give you guys an idea, I mean, I'm old school about my journalism. I call balls and strikes. That's why some people hate this book, some people love this book, but it hurts my heart when our job as journalists is to get as close to the truth as possible every single day. We don't get up with any sort of agenda, and to have a president, call us fake news, to go after my colleagues and not allow them to cover him is so deeply troubling to me. He's bringing in new media, and I'm all for it. But, freedom of the press, the First Amendment, without it.
Amen. So, Molly, this is another. Why doesn't the consistent lying seem to matter? Do you have a thought about that? The consistent lie. I assume they're talking about Donald Trump.
So why doesn't the consistent lying by Trump seem to matter? Is that the
Doesn't matter. Does not matter. Does not matter.
So I think for at least members of Congress, so much of this, and I think Jay was talking about this a little bit before, comes down to their own reelection incentives. And with the exception of a small number of members of the House, and again, depending on what things look like at the midterm time, this may be a longer list of House Republicans.
576 days.
576 days. Thank you, Steve. That their electoral incentives are to just stay with the president. Jay gave the example of Mike Kelly. There are lots of Mike Kellys in this country. Lots of people who represent districts where sort of breaking from the president would be a real political problem for them. I'll tell a story. So I am from the other side of the state of Pennsylvania originally. I grew up in Bethlehem. And in the first Trump administration, the congressman who represented the district that I grew up in, Charlie Dent, relatively moderate member of the House Republican Conference, and when he decided to retire, someone I knew who was a pretty reliable Democratic voter said to me, "Why is Charlie Dent retiring? I would vote for Charlie Dent." And I said, that's exactly Charlie Dent's problem. That those Republicans like him no longer sort of feel like they have a place in the party because many, particularly Republican primary voters in congressional districts, including ones that have the potential to swing, are moving to the right. And so, when that's what matters to someone's own reelection incentives in the House, then there isn't the political reason, even if it would be the right thing to do, to sort of come out against the lying.
So Molly, when a Senator John Fetterman here in Pennsylvania says he will work with the Republicans and he will work with Donald Trump on some issues, getting a lot of pushback from Democrats, and yet, Jay, to your earlier point, this country was formed on compromise. Why is that such a dirty word today?
So it's funny because I think if you look at polling on sort of what people want out of their members of Congress, they will say that sort of in the aggregate, they want both parties to come to the table, that they are frustrated about all of the gridlock and the negativity. But then if they're asked, if your individual member of Congress is going to sort of break and work with the other side, they're like, oh, no, I don't want it to look like that. I want it sort of in the abstract. And I think that's just it's a thorny problem of our polarized politics, is this degree to which, again, people kind of in principle like the idea of the two parties working together in the way that Senator Fetterman has said that he's willing to. But then often when it comes to individual questions or individual members kind of breaking with the party line to work across the aisle, depending on the issue, that's where folks start to run into trouble.
So, Jay, we are at the Jefferson Educational Society. If Thomas Jefferson were to swoon down today and look at our country and look at our democracy and look at what we're facing with this president, based on your expertise of understanding our founders, what do you think he'd think?
I'm always hesitant to answer questions like that because I
Go ahead and answer.
Well, this is my concern, is that I would say something and put it in Jefferson's mouth when it's actually my thought. As a general rule, I like to say, let the dead be dead, right? That Jefferson belongs to the ages. Now, in the spirit of your question is our government behaving in a way that is similar to the way the framers behaved? Well, yeah, a little bit. If you look at the 1790s, it was pretty rough and tumble. I mean, Alexander Hamilton and James Monroe almost fought a duel in 1796, I want to say, The Sedition Act literally criminalized politics in 1798. The Kentucky Resolution responded by declaring a right of nullification. So, politics in a democracy, I think, is a great book on the Jacksonian democracy. I don't remember who wrote it, but it's such a great phrase, I think, still applies. It's called rude republic. That democratic politics is always going to be, you can read the Federalist Papers and sort of indulge in the high-flowing thought of, the founders. But then, the same person like Thomas Jefferson, who might bemoan that, also privately wrote at one point in 1784 to James Madison regarding Patrick Henry. He said, quote, "I think we must earnestly pray for his death." So, politics has always been, in democracy, it's always been sharp elbows.
So you did a great way answering that question. So I'm going to stay with you because there are a couple of themes here. What are your thoughts about whether this country will survive this term? Another question, do you think we'll ever have another legitimate election? So you get the gist of where some in this audience are feeling today.
It is hard to look at the history of the United States of America and not fall back on that line from Otto von Bismarck that God has a special providence for fools, drunkards in the United States of America. That in fact, and you know, it's funny because when you think about
I had never heard that before. Say it again one more time.
it might be apocryphal. I'm not sure if it was an app, but it's often attributed to Bismarck that God has a special providence for fools, drunkards, and the United States of America. And you know, the thing about our history like when you go to Washington, D.C., and you look at, say, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, the World War II Memorial, we remember these great iconic moments in our history. But those only really make up a very small portion of our country's history. And that when you look at the entire scope of history, I like to joke with I teach high school, and I like to joke with my high school students that imagine a student is walking down the hall and he begins to trip. He doesn't fall, but he just sort of keeps tripping and like losing his balance and keeps staggering and like, but never actually falls over. That's kind of us.
Okay. Amy, let's talk about Wisconsin. This question saying, here it is, after Wisconsin, does Trump still have control over voters?
I think it's too soon to say. I mean, how many times have we said, oh, this is the end of
Countless.
Trump?
Yeah.
This is the end of Trump. When
Access
people-
Hollywood, we remember that.
I mean, yeah, exactly. And I know some of my friends in the Democratic Party say, oh, look at Wisconsin, that was a huge win. And I say, let's let this play out a little more. I mean, it was a good day for Democrats and a day that they needed desperately right now. But let's let this play out a little longer.
Molly, what's the end game for the tariffs?
If I knew the answer to that question, someone would pay me a lot more money than they pay me to work at the Brookings Institution. But I mean, I do think that this is so one of the things that we saw during the first Trump administration that was sometimes kind of a check on some of Trump's impulses was things that happened in the markets and individuals kind of in his orbit who called him and said, what you are doing is costing me personally real money. Please change what you're doing. I don't know if that's going to happen again. We don't have the same, there aren't kind of, Steve Mnuchin is not the Secretary of the Treasury again.
And that's a key point. Just touch on that for a moment.
So Steve Mnuchin, who was Trump's first Secretary of the Treasury, very wealthy. And I happen to think at a couple of really key points in the first Trump administration, convinced Trump that if he did certain things, I think this was particularly true around at least one of the moments where Congress needed to raise the debt limit. Basically got into Trump's head that if Congress didn't raise the debt limit, that would be financially catastrophic for Trump and Trump's friends. And I don't know that there's a voice like Mnuchin's in the administration. I could be wrong. And it's also, and then as a result, Mnuchin also became a really key envoy on big economic policy issues with the with Congress during the first Trump administration. So all of kind of the big fiscal deals that they cut, including the ones around the debt limit, which I'll remind everyone is coming. We have to do that again at some point this year. And so that voice is not there in the same way. But I do think it will be it'll be interesting to see how long the kind of tariffs are left to play out. Because even if you were to sort of take on good faith, and I don't think there's a lot of reason to do this, but if you were to sort of think that they are going to quote unquote work in the way that Trump says that he intends for them, like those effects aren't fast acting. Like it's not like we immediately start seeing more U.S. manufacturing jobs on like a politically salient timeline if they stay in place. And this question of will the markets, will Wall Street kind of abide by what we're seeing, and particularly the chaos. So if you were sort of paying attention today, at some point this morning, Kevin Hassett said something like, oh, maybe we're going to pause the the tariffs for 90 days, and the markets shot up. And then someone from the White House said, what's Kevin Hassett talking about?
Fake news.
Went right back down. And so that kind of volatility on its own, I think, is also, and obviously this is not the only place in which we see a lot of volatility in the Trump approach. I think it's just going to be important to watch.
So somebody did their homework. This is for you, Jay. Who wrote this? Typed it up? Did some research? Just raise your hand. It's okay. This is for Jay Cost. You're too embarrassed to? Well, let me read the question. Thank you for doing this. I was going to have you come on up, but anyhow. This is for you, Jay. Considering the blatant cronyism and the spoils of the Trump 47 administration, why is the right allowing this to proceed without any alarm or objection?
Okay. Well, I think that both sides are, I would probably say the answer is partisanship. I think that the Republic and I say this as somebody at the American Enterprise Institute, which has been very skeptical of the Trump political universe, and has been for a long time. And a lot of times what think tanks like AEI do is they are feeders for subsequent administrations. And we're not in that administration. And that's how politics, politics is a team sport. And so whatever incentive people might have for good governance, not to sort of say, oh, well, everybody's a crook or lie. I don't mean it like that. I mean everybody is a human being and we're all a bundle of complicated cross-cutting impulses, right? Partisanship is probably the dominant impulse in politics today, and I think it explains a lot.
Molly, conventional wisdom today, a lot can change, is that the Democrats recapture the House in 2026, the Republicans keep the U.S. Senate. Again, a lot can change. Many people predicted that the Republicans would lose the House. They didn't. So for argument's sake, if that happens in 2027, Democrats have the House regardless of the majority, Republicans keep the Senate, what do the last 2 years of the Trump administration look like?
I would say not unlike the last 2 years of the first Trump administration. I mean, I think one of the things that we saw, and certainly typified by especially the first Trump impeachment, sort of setting aside for a moment the second Trump impeachment, the degree to which when you have divided party control and you have any president of the other party in the White House, what the majority in the House of Representatives spend a lot of time doing is finding ways to try and investigate what's happening and what has happened at the hands of the executive branch. We know, again, from those second 2 years of the first Trump administration, that there would be really significant resistance from the Trump administration to cooperating with those investigations. And that, I think, actually would be sort of ramped up even more in the second, in your hypothetical, in the second 2 years of a Trump administration. In part, going back to something I said earlier about the degree to which this second Trump administration has within it this faction that are really true believers in expansive executive power and in what we call sort of the unitary theory of the executive, the idea that Congress does not actually have the power to check the president in a lot of ways. And so that's sort of what I would expect in the second 2 years.
So let's take the other argument. Conversely, that things settle down, the economy begins to hum along, the market does well, the DOGE cuts are working, tariffs are falling into place, and Republicans keep the House, the Senate, the White House. Yeah, so I think that the scenario you sketch out is possible. One thing I will just say about kind of a long building trend in our elections is that we have moved from sort of a pattern where Republican voters voted more
That if you aligned yourself with the Republican Party, you tended to often be better educated, have a higher income, and those are things that correlate more generally with just voting a lot. We've seen this flip, where now high propensity voters, so people who are just likely to, and this goes back to the Wisconsin question before, people who are likely to go vote at every given opportunity are now much more likely to be Democrats. And so I think that that's another sort of important dynamic as we look ahead towards the midterms. But I will say that I'm not, even in a world where Republicans hold unified control of government for the second 2 years of a Trump administration, which would be a historical aberration, as close as we have to an iron law of American politics, is that the president's party loses control of the House of Representatives in the midterm. The only time this hasn't happened in recent history was in 2002, and that's widely attributed to kind of a post-September 11th long honeymoon for President Bush. But even in a world where Republicans do manage to buck that historical trend, these divisions within the Republican Party are real. And so the things that are stopping Republicans from legislating effectively right now, I don't know that those go away. I don't know that the things that sort of have the different factions of the Republican conference aligned as they are, I don't think success in the midterms just makes those disappear.
The same President Bush who has coined the double Fs, Ferky Ferrari, when he came to Erie, and now he's affectionately known as FF. So, Jay, a historical note, and this is a question, why is Trump so obsessed with Greenland? But keeping in mind, Lincoln, Truman also had their eyes on Greenland. What's this all about?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, it could be one of two things. It could be one of two things. Either it is a bold...
It feels like Greenland here today, I'm just saying.
Yeah, that's a good point. Either it's a bold geostrategic move to, put Russia and China on notice about Greenland, or it's just Trump being Trump. I don't know.
Maybe the latter.
Maybe both. I don't know. Sometimes it's both. I think that's the thing with him. You never know. I mean, is it sometimes it's four-dimensional chess. I mean, look, the guy won the presidency twice. I mean, he's the only person to have won the presidency, as far as I know, the only person to have won the presidency without having either been in politics or the military.
He is.
So he's kind of brilliant, but it's also like, oh, there's Byrd. Like, I don't know. Which one is it? I never know with the guy.
So that ties into this other question, and this is for any of you. Your thoughts on understanding history and the bullying of our allies, whether it's Canada, the European Union, Mexico, and others. Anyone want to weigh in on that? Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, I mean, we've done that before. Look, I mean, we just, took California from Mexico. Like, we started, Panama, Teddy Roosevelt, Panama wasn't interested in letting us build a canal, so Teddy Roosevelt, quietly started a revolution and then immediately recognized the revolutionary government. Look at what Jackson did to the Cherokees. I mean, we do this a lot over the course of our history. Even relatively recently, I mean, we pushed Great Britain to, get rid of their empire after World War II. That was one of the conditions upon which we helped them. And a lot of it is, again, I think a lot of it gets down to that. I think that Trump has long thought that international relationships tend to leave the United States worse off. I think he thought that in the 80s. I think he thought that in the 90s. I think he thought that in the 2000s. I think that he's just thought that. I think what's changed is that there's a lot of average people who now think that too. And I think that it's emboldened him to act on these sorts of things.
Molly, this is a perfect question for you. How many of you are students at Penn State Barron or Gannon or Mercyhurst? I know we have a lot of students. Thank you very much for coming. Or Erie Community College. Should students currently studying poli-sci in government with the hope of working in Washington, D.C., please come, should they be worried about finding work in social welfare policy?
Oh, it's a great question. So it is definitely true that, I was talking before about these sort of factions within the Trump administration. So you've kind of the true executive power believers. You have what I sort of term the retributionists. And then you also have Elon Musk, who, and kind of the Doge orbit, which doesn't actually fit neatly in either of those other two camps. And it is, if I think about the things that have surprised me the most in the first 78 days, is that what you told us we were at?
78, yes.
Steve, is the degree to which Doge has sort of blown through any number of federal agencies, including federal agencies that I would not have thought were going to be ones that they would sort of put their sights on. Probably most importantly, the Social Security Administration. And so I do, it is absolutely true that a lot is changing in Washington in sort of the conduct of policy generally, and particularly in the conduct of kind of what I imagine is under the heading of social welfare policy. But I will also say that, the arc of history is long. And I think one of the things that we're learning as we see, again, Republicans in Congress try to figure out what it would look like to cut some of these programs is that's actually politically hard to do. And so there are all kinds of kind of administrative disruptions, and those are real, and they're going to have real consequences for people. They are already having real consequences for people. I don't want to minimize that. But when we think about kind of the legislative underpinnings, that's also really hard to change, particularly with things that are popular. I wish I could give you a more encouraging answer, but the city is littered with people in these fields who have lost jobs recently, and again, this will and is having consequences for folks around the country.
Amy, I have a final question for you, and then for each one of you, I'm going to give you a minute to talk about what you think the next 78 days will look like, the next couple of months, the challenges that we're going to face as a country. You can take that any way you want. But in order to get to this point, of course, we had to go to election night. And you tell a really compelling story on the Democratic side about what was going on in Team Harris and Team Walz.
Yeah, so they essentially think they are going to win, and Kamala Harris and Tim Walz go into that night thinking that, and are completely shocked and dumbfounded and taken aback when they're told that they've lost, which I think my co-author and I found so shocking in reporting this book, because they were misled by their own team. I mean, I think the bombshell in this book, and there are plenty of good anecdotes, but we essentially say they were gaslit by their own team. And when you read that, and I don't want anyone to relive that experience. I know a lot of my friends are still devastated by that night, but I think the party has to reckon with that. And I think you have to take a look back. I think if you're an alcoholic, you have to first start and admit that you're an alcoholic and look yourself in the mirror and say, this is me and this is my problem, and I have to move forward. And that's sort of where the Democratic Party finds itself right now. They have to first admit what happened with Joe Biden. No one is really admitting that. There was an interesting back and forth today with Tim Walz and Jake Tapper, where Jake Tapper pins Tim Walz down and says, talk about Joe Biden. And Tim Walz almost doesn't want to talk about it. He's like sweeping it right under the rug. And I think that moment says so much about where the party is right now. It has to have more of a reflection moment instead of just saying, okay, we're moving on and we're going to pick our leader and we're just going to be the resistance. And it needs so much more than that right now.
And for Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, it's complicated.
It's very complicated. Kamala Harris blames her loss on Joe Biden, but hasn't really admitted so publicly. But I think she's told a lot of her advisors that as much, and she has said if the race had gone on longer, she could have won, which some people find really hard to believe. A lot of people say if it was a more condensed campaign, then she could have won.
She only had 107 days. I mean, how much more condensed can you get?
Yeah.
So we have the second season of the Trump presidency. 77 million voters cast their ballots for Donald Trump, about 75 million for Kamala Harris. Your thoughts about the next 75, next 80 days, the next couple of months of the Trump administration, and what you'll be looking for?
I am thinking a lot about Andrew Jackson in this second term.
If he dropped down here today, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that would be something. I would probably run and hide, actually. Jackson scares me. Anyway, I'm thinking about Andrew Jackson and his war on the Bank of the United States. In 1832, Andrew Jackson vetoed a bill to recharter the Bank of the United States. He won re-election and then proceeded to remove the deposits of the federal government in the bank and move them into pet banks or state banks. He did this against, he had to fire his Secretary of the Treasury because the Secretary of the Treasury said, Mr. President, I'm only allowed to do this if I believe the deposits are unsafe. And I believe they are. And Jackson said, thank you very much, Secretary Dwayne. That'll be all. We'll have Secretary Roger Taney come in and do it. Now, I bring all this up to say this, is that Andrew Jackson hated banks, instinctively hated them, could not give you an explanation of why he hated them. And indeed, if you read his veto of the Second Bank of the United States, it's bad history, it's bad constitutional theory, and it's bad economics. But he hated it on an instinctual level. And his removal of the deposits from the Bank of the United States caused real economic damage. It contributed to the Panic of 1837. However, the Bank of the United States was dead and it never came back. We did not have a central financial institution until the Federal Reserve in 1913. And I think when I think about Donald Trump and international trade and globalization, my question is he as iron-willed as Andrew Jackson was? And I am inclined at this point to say he is. Like, I kind of think, I would be surprised if he blinks on trade. Now, I'm not a political analyst. I don't have any kind of inside information, certainly not into the thinking of the Trump administration. I don't know what they're thinking. But I do think that Donald Trump has an instinctive, like Jackson, he's just got this instinctive dislike of globalization. He's got an instinctive dislike of the trade with China. He wants to stop it, and he's not going to blink. And I'm curious, I guess, what I want to see in the next 80 days is he as much like Old Hickory as maybe he thinks he is.
Democracy or a Republic by Jay Cost. It's available afterwards. Molly, the next 75, 80 days, your thoughts?
So there are a lot of things I'll be watching, a lot of stuff in Congress, but I think none of us yet in the last 90 minutes have said anything about the federal courts. And so I'll take this opportunity to say that I will be paying very close attention to what happens with the multitude of lawsuits against actions by the Trump administration that are moving their way through the courts. What happens when, not if, but when the Trump administration more openly defies a court order than they have already. I don't know what's happened in the case involving the gentleman who a district judge has said needs to be brought back from El Salvador, who was sent there incorrectly. I don't know what's happened with that in the 90 minutes that we've been sitting here. But I think that, given how much of what has already been tried by the Trump administration is sitting in front of federal judges, including the Supreme Court. I think that's what I would say in response to this question.
And so the Chief Justice, John Roberts, Amy Coney Barrett, what role do you think they will play?
So, I mean, they're kind of the two swing voters. And so, you know, I've been paying a lot of attention to the cases around federal spending. And there was one case involving USAID where the chief and Amy Coney Barrett sided with the liberals. There was another case this week where Roberts sided with the liberals and Barrett sided with the other conservatives. And so we're approaching a point where a lot of these decisions are going to go down into sort of really weedsy questions about statutory authorities and what can the government do with this stream of federal funding, but not this stream of federal funding. But I think in all of them, the chief and Barrett are going to be pivotal.
The book is Exceptions to the Rule. It's also available afterwards. Amy, you get the last word. The next 75 to 80 days, what are your sources telling you?
My gosh. I mean, I hear an earful from people every single day about where we are right now, but I'm so curious to see what the Democratic Party does in response to Trump. They can't just be, as I mentioned before, the party of resistance. They have to be so much more than that. They have to find an agenda. They have to go back to their roots. They have to talk about Pell Grants and all the things that made them Democrats and find their way back somehow. And I'm curious to see how they do that and who they rely upon to be the messenger. It's a fascinating time to see. I'm just curious to see how they rebuild.
The book is titled Fight, and just one side note, you never intended to write this until the debate.
Yeah, so my co-author and I have written two other election books. One in 2016, which many of you guys might have heard of, called Shattered. And then we wrote another one in 2020, and we had hung up our hats and said, this is it for us. And we kept getting, our sources kept asking us, are you doing another book? And we kept saying, no, we're done. And then the debate happened, and we both texted that night, actually, and said, should we do one? And then our publisher, a week or so later, came to us and said, would you guys want to do one? And we could not do a book.
Amy Parnes, Molly Reynolds, Jay Cost, a three-peat for you. We have all of Pennsylvania covered, and now we'll make you, as a Floridian, an official honorary Erie resident. Will you come back in another 75 days, or maybe this time next year, and we'll have a revisit on where things
Kind of
stand?
the summer.
This is summer. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. We appreciate it.